So we made his changes, working around the clock to meet the original deadline despite having to essentially start over. And guess what happened? Everything went slightly off track, just like I'd predicted. Actually, slightly is being generous. It was a complete disaster. The new messaging confused InnovateTech's focus groups. Instead of the clear, compelling value proposition we'd originally developed, we now had this vague, emotional campaign that didn't clearly communicate what the app actually did or why small business owners should care about it. The A/B tests on the new creative concepts performed 40% worse than our original designs. Even worse, the client's internal stakeholders were split on the new direction, with half of them preferring the original strategy we'd scrapped. The final presentation was painful to sit through. I watched Sarah's face as we walked through the new campaign concepts, and I could see her trying to be diplomatic while clearly being disappointed. The CEO of InnovateTech, who had been enthusiastic about our original approach, kept asking questions that made it clear he didn't understand how this new strategy connected to their business objectives. "I'm a bit confused," he said during the Q&A portion of the presentation. "When we first started working together, you seemed to really understand that our customers are analytical decision makers who want to see concrete ROI data. This new approach feels like we're trying to sell them luxury cars instead of business software. Can you help me understand the strategic thinking behind this shift?" Mr. Henderson jumped in before I could answer, launching into this rambling explanation about market dynamics and emotional engagement strategies that didn't address the CEO's actual concerns. I sat there, dying inside, knowing that I could have answered that question perfectly if we'd stuck with our original research-based approach. By the end of the presentation, it was clear that InnovateTech was having serious doubts about moving forward with us. They didn't say no outright, but they asked for time to evaluate their options and consider how this fits with their overall marketing strategy. In client speak, that's basically a polite way of saying thanks, but no thanks. We lost the account. A 6-figure contract that should have been a slam dunk turned into a humiliating rejection, and we had to scramble to explain to upper management why we'd failed to close what had seemed like a sure thing. And when it all, I have a story that still makes my blood boil and yet fills me with this quiet sense of satisfaction that I can't quite shake. You know those workplace horror stories you hear about on Where You're Like, no way that actually happened? Well, this one's mine, and honestly, I'm still amazed at how it all played out. Buckle up, because this is going to be a wild ride. So let me paint you a picture of what my life looked like back then. For over a year, and I mean a full, soul-crushing, mind-numbing year, I worked under this boss, Mr. Henderson, who literally embodied every single toxic trait you could imagine in a. I'm talking about a guy who needed to approve every email, every report, every tiny task that should take in 5 minutes, but somehow stretched into hour-long discussions about font choices, comma placement, and whether I should use best regards or sincerely at the end of emails. And I'm not exaggerating here. This man would literally sit behind his computer screen, waiting for notifications from our project management system so he could immediately jump into whatever we were working on. It felt like having a helicopter parent at work, except this parent had the power to control my paycheck and my career prospects. It was absolutely suffocating in ways I didn't even know were possible. I'm Frances, by the way. I'm 28, and at the time this all went down, I was working at this mid-sized marketing firm downtown called Associates. Picture one of those converted warehouse buildings with exposed brick walls and industrial lighting that's supposed to look creative and modern. The pay was decent, around $55,000 a year, which isn't bad for someone with my experience level, and the benefits weren't terrible. We had decent health insurance, 3 weeks of vacation time, and they even had one of those fancy coffee machines in the break room that made you feel like you were working at a tech startup. Honestly, in this economy, that felt like winning the lottery. I mean, I'd been job hunting for months before landing this position, sending out probably hundreds of applications and getting maybe a dozen interviews. So when they offered me the job, I was over the moon. I thought I'd finally found my place in the corporate world. But man, Was I paying for it in other ways that I never could have anticipated during the interview process? You're probably wondering why I put up with it for so long, right? Trust me, I asked myself that question every single morning when my alarm went off at 6:30 a.m., and I felt this immediate sense of dread about facing another day. You know that feeling when your stomach drops and you realize you have to go somewhere you absolutely don't want to be? That was my life for over a year. The truth is, I needed the job desperately. My student loans were this massive, looming monster that followed me everywhere. We're talking about $87,000 in debt from my marketing degree and MBA. That's $850 a month in payments that weren't going anywhere, no matter how much I wanted to pretend they didn't exist. And the job market in our city was brutal. The unemployment rate was hovering around 8%, and marketing positions were especially competitive because everyone and their cousins seemed to have a marketing degree these days. I'd been unemployed for 4 months before landing this job, living off my savings and getting more desperate by the week. I remember checking my bank account obsessively, watching the numbers get smaller and smaller, calculating how many more months I could survive without income. The stress was eating me alive, and I was starting to have panic attacks about my financial future. Plus, and this is probably going to sound naive, but I'm not naturally a confrontational person. I grew up in a small town in Ohio where you didn't make waves, you didn't cause trouble, and you certainly didn't challenge authority figures. My parents, both blue-collar people, always taught me about keeping my head down, showing respect to your superiors, and believing that integrity and hard work would eventually pay off. But it wasn't just about the wasted time, you know? It was so much deeper than that. It was like he was systematically eroding my confidence, piece by piece, day after day, until I started questioning everything about my professional abilities. He'd constantly second-guess my decisions, even on projects I'd successfully led before. And I'm talking about projects where I'd gotten glowing feedback from clients, where the results spoke for themselves, where I'd proven my competence beyond any reasonable doubt. I remember this one campaign I developed for a local restaurant chain. It was a social media strategy that ended up increasing their online engagement by 340% and drove actual foot traffic to their locations. The client was thrilled, their sales were up, and they were already talking about expanding our contract. But somehow, Mr. Henderson managed to find fault with the reporting format I'd used to present the results. "Francis," he said, pulling me into his office after the client meeting, "I noticed you used a bar chart to show the engagement metrics. Don't you think a pie chart would have been more visually impactful?" I just stood there thinking, are you serious right now? The campaign was a massive success, and you're worried about chart types. But that was typical Mr. Henderson. He'd focus on the most irrelevant details while completely missing the big picture. And gradually, I started second-guessing myself on everything. Should I use blue or green for this graph? Should I say increased or improved in this sentence? Should I schedule this meeting for 2:00 p.m. or 2:15 p.m.? I was paralyzed by indecision because I knew that no matter what choice I made, he'd find something wrong with it. The worst part? He'd take credit for our team's accomplishments in meetings with upper management while simultaneously undermining us in private. I remember this one presentation where our team had worked overtime for weeks to land this huge client, a tech startup that was looking to rebrand completely. We're talking about a 6-figure contract that would have set us up nicely for the quarter. We'd pulled together this amazing campaign proposal that covered everything from logo design to social media strategy to influencer partnerships. I personally had spent countless hours researching their target demographic, analyzing their competitors, and crafting messaging that would resonate with their audience. My colleague Jake had created these incredible visual mock-ups, and Sarah had developed a content calendar that was honestly a work of art. The presentation to the client went flawlessly. They loved everything, asked great questions, and you could see the excitement in their eyes as we walked through our strategy. By the end of the meeting, they were practically ready to sign on the dotted line. And guess who got to present it to the executives? Mr. Henderson. Guess who got mentioned as the driving force behind the success when he reported back to upper management? Mr. Henderson. Meanwhile, He'd spent the entire project development phase nitpicking the color scheme, questioning our strategy every step of the way, and making us redo work that was perfectly fine the first time around. I found out about his presentation to the executives through office gossip, and it made me physically sick. He'd apparently spent 20 minutes explaining his innovative approach to client acquisition and his hands-on leadership style that had resulted in such a successful pitch. No mention of the team's countless hours of work, no recognition of the research and creativity that had actually won the client over. That night, I went home and cried, not just because I was frustrated, but because I felt so powerless and invisible. Here I was, pouring my heart and soul into work that I was genuinely passionate about, only to have someone else take all the credit while treating me like an incompetent intern who needed constant supervision. But here's where it gets really frustrating. The microaggressions started creeping in, and they were so subtle at first that I almost convinced myself I was imagining things. You know how it is when something feels wrong, but you can't quite put your finger on what's happening. That was my daily reality. He'd comment on my tone in emails, even when they were completely professional and factual. Like, I'd send a straightforward update about project timelines. Something like, "Hi team, just wanted to let everyone know that the Johnson account deliverables will be ready by Thursday as scheduled." And he'd pull me aside to talk about how I needed to be more collaborative in my communication style. "Francis," he'd say with this condescending tone, "I'm getting some feedback that your emails can come across as a bit direct. Maybe try adding some warmth to your messages. Something like, 'Hope everyone's having a great day,' at the beginning might help." Meanwhile, my male colleagues would send emails like, "Need the budget numbers by Cobb today," with no pleasantries whatsoever, and somehow that was just fine. When Jake sent a message saying, "Client rejected the concept, we need to pivot immediately," that was him being efficient and action-oriented. But when I sent similar messages, I needed to add more warmth and be less direct. And can I just say, as a woman of color in a predominantly white office, I started noticing some patterns that made my stomach turn. The way Mr. Henderson interacted with me versus how he treated my white male colleagues was like night and day. They could be blunt, they could push back on deadlines, they could even disagree with him in meetings, and somehow that was just them being assertive or passionate about their work. But me, if I so much as suggested a different approach or questioned a decision based on my expertise, suddenly I was being difficult or not a team player. I remember one meeting where I politely disagreed with his assessment of our target demographic for a campaign. I had actual data to back up my position, survey results, focus group feedback, demographic studies, and I presented it respectfully and professionally. His response, "Francis, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but let's try to stay focused on solutions rather than problems." Meanwhile, 20 minutes later, when my white male colleague Brad made almost the exact same point, Mr. Henderson said, "Great insight, Brad. That's exactly the kind of strategic thinking we need." I felt like I was constantly walking on eggshells, trying to find this impossible balance between being professional and not being too assertive, between being confident and not being threatening, between contributing to discussions and not being seen as argumentative. It was exhausting in ways I'd never experienced before. And don't even get me started on the name thing. My name is Francis, not exactly complicated, right? It's a classic name, easy to pronounce, only 2 syllables. But somehow, Mr. Henderson managed to get it wrong every single time. And I'm not talking about occasional slip-ups that happen to everyone. I'm talking about consistent, deliberate mispronunciations that felt increasingly intentional. He'd call me Francis in meetings, in emails, and once he even called me during a client call, which was mortifying because it made me sound like his secretary rather than the marketing strategist who developed the entire campaign we were discussing. I corrected him politely at first, then more directly, and eventually I just gave up because he'd act like it was some kind of joke whenever I brought it up. "Oh, Francis, you know I'm terrible with names," he'd say with this laugh that made my skin crawl. "So many F names around here I can barely keep track." Except there weren't any other F names in our department. It was just me. And somehow he never had trouble remembering that Brad was Brad, or that Jake was Jake, or that Mike from accounting was Mike. The most infuriating part was that he'd get my name right when he needed something from me urgently. If there was a crisis with a client or a tight deadline, suddenly he could pronounce Francis perfectly. But in normal day-to-day interactions, it was back to Francis, or whatever variation he felt like using that day. I started wondering if I was being too sensitive about it, but then I mentioned it to my friend Lisa, who worked in HR at a different company. She immediately said, "Oh, honey, that's not an accident. That's a power play. He's letting you know that you're not important enough for him to remember your actual name." And as soon as she said it, I realized she was absolutely right. The constant feeling of being watched and judged by a completely different standard was absolutely exhausting. I felt like I was under a microscope, like every move I made was being analyzed and found lacking somehow. It was chipping away at my resilience in ways I didn't even realize at the time. I started having trouble sleeping. I'd get stress headaches that would last for days, and I found myself snapping at my family and friends over little things that normally wouldn't bother me. That's when I started documenting everything, and I mean everything. I kept a detailed log of every unreasonable demand, every belittling comment, every instance where he clearly overstepped his bounds. I saved emails, took screenshots of project timelines, and kept notes on meeting discussions. At first, it was just for my own sanity, like proof that I wasn't going crazy, that this really was as bad as it felt. I started with a simple Excel spreadsheet on my personal laptop at home. Date, time, description of incident, any witnesses present, and my emotional response. It sounds clinical when I describe it like that, but at the time, it felt like the only way to maintain some sense of reality in what was becoming an increasingly surreal work environment. Some entries were about big things, like the time he publicly criticized my presentation style in front of a client, saying I needed to work on my executive presence, despite the fact that the client had specifically complimented my expertise. But other entries were about smaller things that felt significant in the context of his overall behavior pattern. Like the time he rearranged the seating in our team meetings so that I was sitting with my back to the whiteboard, making it difficult for me to see visual presentations. When I asked if I could move to a different seat, he said the current arrangement was more conducive to collaborative energy flow. I kid you not, that's exactly what he said. Or the time he scheduled a team lunch and forgot to invite me, then acted surprised when I mentioned I hadn't heard about it. "Oh, I thought someone else had told you," he said. "We just went to that little down the street. Nothing formal." But it wasn't nothing formal. They'd apparently spent 2 hours discussing strategy for our biggest client account, and I was completely left out of the conversation. I started taking photos of whiteboards after meetings, saving drafts of emails before I sent them, and even recording voice memos on my phone during my commute home to capture my thoughts while they were fresh. I know it sounds paranoid, but I had this growing sense that I was going to need evidence of what was happening, even if I wasn't sure yet what I was going to do with it. But then came the turning point, and honestly, it was like something out of a workplace nightmare. We were working on this crucial project for one of our biggest clients, a tech startup called Innovate Tech that was launching a revolutionary app for small business owners. This wasn't just any project. It was a make-or-break campaign that could potentially lead to a long-term partnership worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The deadline was tight, but totally manageable if we stuck to our original plan and timeline. This was a campaign I'd been developing for months, ever since we'd first started courting Innovate Tech as a potential client. I knew their target market inside and out, I understood their brand voice, and I had developed relationships with key stakeholders on their team. I was genuinely excited about this project because it was exactly the kind of innovative, data-driven work I'd gotten into marketing to do. I'd spent weeks researching their competitors, analyzing market trends, and crafting a strategy that would position them uniquely in a crowded marketplace. I'd conducted focus groups, run preliminary A/B tests on messaging concepts, and even brought in a freelance graphic designer I knew who specialized in tech startup branding. Everything was coming together beautifully, and the client had been thrilled with our initial concepts and strategic direction. But Mr. Henderson couldn't leave well enough alone. 2 weeks before our final presentation to Innovate Tech's executive team, he called an emergency meeting to discuss what he called strategic pivots based on his market intuition. I'll never forget sitting in that conference room, watching him pace back and forth in front of the whiteboard while he explained why we needed to completely overhaul our approach. He insisted on making last-minute changes based on what he called his gut feelings, rather than any actual data or client feedback. We're talking about fundamental shifts in messaging that would change the entire tone of the campaign, complete redesigns of visual elements that had already been approved by the client, and strategy pivots that made absolutely no sense given what we knew about Innovate Tech's target audience and business goals. "I've been in this business for 15 years, he said, pointing at the strategy documents we'd spent months perfecting, "and I can tell when something's not going to resonate with decision makers. This whole approach is too cerebral. We need something with more emotional punch, something that speaks to the heart rather than the head." The problem was, everything we'd learned about Innovate Tech's customer base indicated they were highly analytical, data-driven small business owners who made purchasing decisions based on ROI and practical benefits. The emotional punch approach would have been completely wrong for this particular audience, and I had the research to prove it. I tried to push back, professionally, of course. I presented the research we'd done, showed him the client's positive feedback on our original direction, and explained how these changes would impact our timeline and budget. I pulled out the focus group reports, the competitor analysis, and even testimonials from Innovate Tech's existing customers that supported our current messaging strategy. "Mr. Henderson," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and professional, "I really think we should stick with the data-driven approach here. We've done extensive research on their target demographic, and everything points to the fact that these customers respond better to concrete benefits and ROI calculations rather than emotional appeals." But he wasn't having any of it. He literally waved his hand dismissively at the research documents I'd spent weeks compiling. "Trust me on this one, Francis," he said with that condescending smile that I'd grown to hate. "I've been in this business longer than you've been alive. Sometimes you have to go with your instincts rather than getting down in all these numbers and charts." Can you believe that? I just stood there like, really? Did that just happen? Not only was he completely dismissing my expertise and months of careful research, but he was also making it about age and experience in this way that felt so patronizing I wanted to scream. The fact that he'd mispronounced my name as Francis while delivering this condescending lecture just made it even worse. And here's the kicker. He wasn't even that much older than me. Maybe 10 years, tops. It wasn't like I was some fresh-out-of-college intern who didn't know anything about marketing. I had an MBA, 5 years of relevant experience, and I'd successfully managed campaigns for clients in similar industries. But somehow, none of that mattered because he had instincts. So we made his changes. And let me tell you, it was like watching a train wreck in slow motion. We had to completely rebuild the messaging framework, redesign all the visual materials, and essentially start from scratch on the content strategy. The freelance designer I'd brought in was frustrated because she had to scrap weeks of work and start over with a completely different creative direction. The copywriter had to rewrite everything from the website copy to the social media content. But the worst part was explaining these changes to the client. I had to sit in a meeting with Innovate Tech's marketing director and pretend like this sudden shift in strategy was some kind of brilliant strategic evolution rather than my boss's random whim. The client was confused, understandably, because they'd been excited about our original direction and couldn't understand why we were suddenly pivoting to something completely different. "Is there something about our business model that we didn't communicate clearly?" asked their marketing director, Sarah, who I'd built a great working relationship with over the previous months. "Because we were really excited about the analytical approach you'd outlined. It felt like you really understood our customers." I had to bite my tongue and deliver Mr. Henderson's talking points about market evolution and strategic pivoting, while internally cringing at how ridiculous it all sounded. Sarah was too polite to say anything directly, but I could see the skepticism in her eyes. She trusted me, and now it looked like I was either incompetent or dishonest, neither of which was actually true. So we made his changes, And guess what happened? Everything went slightly off track, just like I'd predicted. The client was confused by the messaging shift, the new design didn't test well with focus groups, and we had to scramble to fix everything before the launch date. It was a complete mess. And when it all started falling apart, who do you think Mr. Henderson blamed? That's right, the team. Suddenly it was our fault for not executing his vision properly. He never once acknowledged that his last-minute changes were the root cause of all the problems. Instead, he called a team meeting to discuss our communication issues and project management failures. I sat in that meeting, listening to him tear apart our work while taking zero responsibility for his own role in the chaos, and something just snapped inside me. Not in an explosive way, but more like a quiet, cold realization. I thought, this man is not just making my life miserable. His incompetence is actively hurting the team, our clients, and the company. That's when I decided I wasn't going to take it anymore. But here's the thing, I knew I couldn't just march into HR with a bunch of complaints. That would likely turn into a he said, she said situation, and given the office dynamics, I wasn't confident about how that would play out. I needed a different approach. So I started working on something in my spare time. You know how Mr. Henderson was obsessed with project management software? He'd made us switch to this new system that tracked everything, every task, every deadline, every communication, every change request. He said it was his way of staying on top of things and making sure nothing fell through the cracks. Well, I decided to use his own weapon against him. I spent weeks going through the system, meticulously compiling a timeline of his interventions on various projects. I documented every instance where his decisions directly contradicted the initial project plan, every time his changes caused delays, and every occasion where his gut feelings led to problems we had to fix later. I cross-referenced this with our internal communication logs, client feedback, and budget reports. I even reached out to colleagues, carefully and confidentially, to get their perspective on some of the project challenges we'd faced. And you know what? I wasn't the only one who'd noticed the patterns. Other team members had their own stories of Mr. Henderson's micromanagement causing problems, but everyone was too scared or too busy to do anything about it. The data was absolutely damning. I could show, with concrete numbers and timestamps, how Mr. Henderson's management style was directly impacting our team's efficiency, our client satisfaction scores, and even our department's profitability. It wasn't about emotions or personality conflicts. It was about measurable business outcomes. I spent another week crafting this presentation. I made it clean, professional, and completely factual. No emotional language, no personal attacks, just cold, hard data presented in a way that painted a clear picture of systemic management issues. I included charts showing project timeline slippages, graphs comparing client satisfaction scores before and after Mr. Henderson's interventions, and cost analyses of the additional hours we'd spent fixing problems his changes had created. But here's where I got strategic. I didn't go to HR. Instead, I identified a senior manager I knew to be data-driven and fair, someone who cared more about results than office politics. Her name was, and she was the VP of Client Services. I'd worked with her on a few cross-departmental projects, and she'd always impressed me with her analytical approach and her genuine concern for team effectiveness. I sent her an anonymous email with the presentation attached. I framed it as a concern for project efficiency and team morale, explaining that I'd noticed some patterns in our department's performance metrics and thought she might want to take a look. I was careful not to make it sound like a personal vendetta, just a concerned employee highlighting business issues that might need attention. The waiting was torture. For about a week, nothing happened. I started second-guessing myself, wondering if I'd made a huge mistake. What if figured out it was me? What if she didn't take it seriously? What if Mr. Henderson somehow found out and made my life even worse? But then things started shifting. I noticed having more conversations with people from our department. She scheduled one-on-one meetings with several team members, including me. When she met with me, she asked some very specific questions about project timelines and management processes. She was subtle about it, but I could tell she was investigating. A few days later, I overheard talking to someone from HR about management effectiveness reviews and restructuring opportunities. My heart was pounding, but I tried to act normal and focus on my work. The fallout was swift and honestly more dramatic than I'd expected. Within about 3 weeks of sending that presentation, Mr. Henderson was quietly reassigned to what they called a special projects role. It was one of those corporate moves where they don't actually fire someone, but they essentially remove them from any real authority or team management responsibilities. I heard through the office grapevine that senior management had been concerned about our department's performance metrics for a while, but they hadn't been able to pinpoint the cause. My presentation had apparently provided the missing piece of the puzzle, showing them exactly where the problems were coming from. There were no dramatic confrontations or public firings, just a quiet announcement that Mr. Henderson would be transitioning to focus on strategic initiatives, while a new manager was brought in to oversee day-to-day operations. Most people probably didn't even realize what had really happened. But I knew, and the moral satisfaction was absolutely immense. It wasn't about revenge in a petty sense, you know? It was about accountability. It was about proving that my work had value, that my team's efforts mattered, and that incompetent management shouldn't be allowed to destroy morale and productivity just because someone's too scared to speak up. The best part was that I'd used the very tools Mr. Henderson thought were controlling us to expose his own failures. All that micromanagement, all that obsessive tracking and documentation, it had created a perfect paper trail of his incompetence. Our new manager, Sarah, was like a breath of fresh air. She actually trusted us to do our jobs. Can you imagine that? She set clear expectations, provided support when we needed it, and then got out of our way to let us work. It was amazing how quickly the whole department's energy shifted. Within a few months, our productivity was up, client satisfaction scores were climbing, and people were actually excited about coming to work again. The collaborative spirit that had been crushed under Mr. Henderson's regime came roaring back. We started having real creative brainstorming sessions instead of those painful meetings where everyone was afraid to speak up. And as for me, well, about 6 months after Mr. Henderson's reassignment, I got promoted to senior marketing strategist. It came with a significant raise, more autonomy, and the respect I'd been craving all along. My new role gave me the freedom to lead projects from start to finish without someone constantly looking over my shoulder and questioning every decision. The promotion interview was actually pretty emotional for me. Who by then I'd figured out had been the one to act on my anonymous presentation, told me that my work had been consistently excellent and that she was impressed by my commitment to team success and operational efficiency. She never directly acknowledged the presentation, but there was something in the way she phrased things that made me think she knew exactly who had provided that crucial data. Looking back now, about a year and a half later, I realized this whole experience taught me some really important lessons. First, that sometimes the most effective way to fight injustice isn't with yelling or emotional confrontations, but with cold, hard facts and a well-executed plan. Data doesn't lie, and when you present it properly, it's pretty hard to argue against. Second, I learned that I'm stronger and more strategic than I ever gave myself credit for. The person who started working under Mr. Henderson, scared, accommodating, willing to accept mistreatment just to keep the peace, that person grew into someone who could identify a problem, develop a solution, and execute it flawlessly. But maybe most importantly, I learned that standing up for yourself and your team isn't just about personal satisfaction. When bad managers are allowed to operate unchecked, it hurts everyone, the employees, the clients, and ultimately the company's bottom line. By speaking up, even anonymously, I helped create a better working environment for my entire team. The company culture in our department has been transformed. We have regular team meetings where people actually contribute ideas instead of sitting in terrified silence. We get recognized for our successes, and when problems arise, we work together to solve them instead of playing the blame game. Mr. Henderson, from what I hear, is still working on his special projects. I occasionally see him in the elevator or the break room, and he's always polite enough, though I sometimes catch him looking at me with this expression I can't quite read. I don't think he ever figured out who was behind his downfall, but honestly, I don't really care if he did. Sometimes I wonder if I should feel bad about what happened to him. After all, he probably didn't wake up every morning thinking about how to make his employees miserable. He likely thought he was just doing his job. But then I remember all those meetings where he took credit for our work, all those times he made last-minute changes that created chaos, all those microaggressions that made me question my own worth and abilities. And you know what? I don't feel bad at all. Actions have consequences, and management is a responsibility, not just a title. If you can't handle that responsibility without crushing the people under you, then maybe you shouldn't be in a management position. The whole experience has made me a better leader too. In my new role, I make sure to give credit where it's due, to listen to my team members' concerns, and to create an environment where people feel safe to contribute their ideas and push back when something doesn't make sense. I never want anyone working with me to feel the way I felt under Mr. Henderson. I've also become something of a mentor to younger employees who are dealing with similar situations. When someone comes to me with complaints about micromanagement or workplace discrimination, I don't just tell them to tough it out or look for another job. I help them think strategically about how to document issues and present their concerns in ways that leadership will take seriously. Because here's the thing, most companies actually do want to retain good employees and maintain positive work environments. But they can't fix problems they don't know about, and they can't act on vague complaints or emotional outbursts. They need data, they need documentation, and they need to understand the business impact of management failures. That presentation I created has actually become a bit of a template that I've shared with other people facing similar situations. Obviously, every case is different, but the basic principle remains the same. Document everything, focus on business impact rather than personal grievances, and present your case to someone who has both the authority and the motivation to make changes. The irony isn't lost on me that Mr. Henderson's obsession with tracking and monitoring ultimately provided the tools for his own undoing. If he'd been a more trusting manager, if he'd given us the autonomy to do our jobs without constant oversight, there wouldn't have been such a detailed record of his interference and its negative consequences. But I guess that's the thing about, they create their own problems. They don't trust their employees to work independently, so they implement systems to watch everything. But those same systems end up documenting their own failures when their constant meddling starts causing issues. I still work at the same company, and I love my job now. The stress that used to keep me awake at night is gone, replaced by genuine excitement about the projects I'm working on and the team I'm part of. My student loans are almost paid off. I've gotten 2 more promotions since the initial one, and I'm actually being considered for a management position myself. If someone had told me 3 years ago that I'd go from being a miserable, micromanaged employee to being a successful leader in the same company, I probably wouldn't have believed them. But sometimes the best revenge really is living well, and using your intelligence to create positive change instead of just complaining about problems. The whole experience taught me that you don't have to accept toxic behavior just because it's coming from someone in authority. You don't have to quit your job or have dramatic confrontations to make things better. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is gather your evidence, think strategically, and let the facts speak for themselves. And honestly, every time I see our team collaborating effectively, every time a colleague tells me they feel heard and valued, every time we deliver exceptional work because we're not being hampered by micromanagement, that's when I feel the real satisfaction. Not because I got revenge on Mr. Henderson, but because I helped create something better for everyone. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Sometimes the quiet victories are the most meaningful ones.